Welcome, my friends, to a new episode of Frameworks. And in this episode, we're going to talk about EBL or IBL. Now, what does EBL or IBL as a framework stand for? Well, actually, it stands for Enquiry-based Learning. So it's going to be EBL if you're going to follow the British spelling, or IBL if you're going to follow the American spelling. But that's not a big deal. The most important thing is how this framework works, where it comes from. Let's talk about it in this episode. Now, the question is, where did this framework come from? What is the origin of this framework? And actually, the philosophy of inquiry-based learning finds its antecedents in constructivist learning theories. Now the question is, who are the antecedents of constructivist learning theories? And we could say Jean Piaget, also Lev Vygotsky, and John Dewey and Paulo Freire. Now, let's talk a bit about constructivist theories in learning. What does that mean? And we know that the verb construct means build. And this is what these theories are about. They believe that learning happens when you search for the information, find the information yourself, compare the information you have, and finally you can construct a point of view about the matter you are searching for. That's why we call it constructivist theories, which is something that is completely different from memorizing, from direct teaching, because those people believe that learning happens not by receiving, but actually by constructing, which makes a lot of sense, to be honest. And I believe that many of us as teachers, sometimes, or I would say many times, we feel that when you look for something and then when you compare it with other things, it becomes very difficult to lose it. It gets stuck in your memory and it becomes very hard to lose it. It becomes part of you. But if you're just told about it directly, it's difficult to recall it. So when you search for something, when you exert effort to find something, this most of the time remains with you, and it becomes very hard to lose it later. And this is, where IBL comes from. And this is in short, of course. But what are the benefits of the EBL or IBL framework? Like, if we apply this in some of our lessons, what are the benefits that we expect? And I would say benefit number one, it improves the student's level of thinking and learning process. And no doubt. Why? Because as a student now, I need to search. I need to decide what to search for. And I need to learn how to filter the information I get and compare the information I have with other sources and also with what my friends have discovered and found. And then I come to conclusion. That needs a lot of thinking. So yes, it develops a student's thinking and learning process. Why learning process? Because if you did it once, you can repeat it again, and this becomes part of how you learn, which is like really nice. Another benefit, it develops cognitive skills and leads to lifelong learning. Of course, because now I need to read on my own and understand. There isn't a lot of help from the side of the teacher. Yes, the teacher would give me feedback later, but I need to depend a lot on myself during the session to understand and analyze and compare and that develops by cognitive skills. That develops how I comprehend things, how I understand things. And also it leads to lifelong learning, because it makes the students autonomous. They can learn later on their own, and that's what we want. So that's another plus. A third benefit is fostering more interest in the material. Why? Because now I need to research. I need to find, good sources and good material to use in my research and to find the information I want. And that makes material more interesting, because once I find what I want, it's amazing. Let's read it and let's share it, right? And again, that's also another benefit. A fourth benefit is it makes the students better investigators, people who are able to look for facts and find them, evaluate them. And that is completely different from memorizing and recalling. Because now when I search for something and I find it and I understand it, it becomes very hard to lose it. Another benefit, giving the students a sense of ownership of the learning. They don't feel that they are there in the classroom to do what they're told by the teacher. They feel that they are the ones who control the learning process. They are the ones who lead. And this is very important. And again, it also helps them become independent learners later. Another benefit is developing a love for learning. Why? Because you are the one who's leading a process. You are the one who's searching and finding and comparing. And when you find the answer you're looking for, you're kind of satisfied and encouraged. And this whole atmosphere makes the students love learning more and more. Another benefit is increasing collaboration among students, because now they need to help each other. They need to be researchers together. They need to exchange the information they get, compare, discuss, find, reach conclusions. It's amazing when it comes to team spirit. Now, what are the stages of the IBL or EBL framework? And there are 5 main stages in this approach. The first one is what we call observation or orientation. And in this stage, you introduce the topic, and you can do that using direct teaching or using guided discovery or using self-directed discovery. The most important thing in this stage is to make your students interested in the topic you intend to teach. That's very important. Then we come to the second stage, and the second stage is called conceptualize or question. And in this stage, you want your students to come up with the questions that they would search for later. So it's amazing. So you help your students come up with the questions that they would search for. And of course, in this stage, you need to be ready as a teacher with a list of questions for feedback. So when you're checking what your students, have come up with, and then they missed some important questions, then you need to comment and you need to add these questions. But again, you let the students come up with the questions. Then after the conceptualize question stage, the third stage is investigation. And this is the time when the students start researching the topic. This is when they start searching for information and data about it. And of course, don't forget to provide your students with an access to an online library or a real library in the classroom where they can go and search. And also you can recommend some websites or recommend some sources and references where they can go and do their researches. And part, of course, of the investigation stage is to stress on evidence that whenever they find a piece of information and they want to state something, there has to be evidence, and they need to tell you where this evidence comes from. That's also very important. Now, after the investigation stage, we have the conclusion stage, where students can work together, reaching a conclusion about, the topic and the answers to the questions they came up with in the first place. And then the last stage will be the discussion stage, where students actually present their conclusions under the eyes of the teacher. And the teacher, of course, can give feedback and comment on their conclusions. Right. So these are the 5 stages of the EBL or IBL framework. Now, I know that just talking about the stages is not enough, and it really helps when we choose a topic and try to see how these 5 stages would fit with that topic if we're going to take it into the classroom. And the beauty of the IBL that it can work with any subject. Like, you can teach geography with it, you can teach history with it, you can teach psychology with it, you can teach methodology with it. This time I chose literature. Also for the reason that many teachers ask me to talk about teaching literature, because this is something that they do, especially in many international schools. And it will be interesting to see some teachers also using the IBL or the EBL when teaching literature. So I chose a wonderful poem by William Shakespeare, and this is Sonnet 18. So, Sonnet 18, I love it. Okay, so let's read Sonnet 18, but let's read it with original pronunciation, which is as close as possible to how Shakespeare used to pronounce English in his days. Right, so let me read it. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou'rt more lovely and more temperate, rough winds to shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lays a thou too short to date. Sometime to what the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, but chance or nature's changing course and trimmed. But the eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag the wondrous in his shade, when in eternal loins to time the grost. So long as men can breathe or eyes can say, so long lives this, and this gives life to there. Wonderful, I love it. Right, so again, we're going to teach this piece of art. We're going to teach Sonnet 18 by William Shakespeare. Now let's go through the stages of the IBL. How can I teach this song using the IBL? And stage number 1 is actually observation and orientation. And one thing you can do is that you throw a question after another at your students. Like how? Like, for example, question number 1, you ask your students, who is the most famous English poet? And then you get them to discuss together, search the internet, compare the results they found, and then they give you the answer. And of course you give them feedback and you say, so actually the most famous poet is William Shakespeare. Then you throw the second question, which is, what's the most famous poem for Shakespeare? I want you to research, go back to your references, and then discuss with your partners. And then again, they go to the references, or they check the websites you recommended for them, right? And then they discuss together, and then they tell you, oh yes, the most famous poem for Shakespeare is Sonnet 18, and like that. Then you hit with a third question. What does the word sonnet mean? And again, same process. And then you hit with another question. When was Sonnet 18 written? Because that's the context, right? Wonderful. And then another one. How was it originally pronounced? And then you tell your students, try to read it, on your own first, and then try to compare your pronunciation. And then you give them feedback. For example, reading the original pronunciation. If of course that is part of what you want to do. If you don't want to do an OP or original pronunciation for the poem, fair enough. It depends on what you want to do with your students. Actually, it's not a must, right? Then once this stage is over, we move to the second stage, which is conceptualize question. Now, you want to encourage your students now to come up with the right questions about Sonnet 18. Now this is very important, and you can guide a bit. You're not going to give them the questions, you can guide them. And your guidance can be around the areas you need to focus on. So for example, you can get them to make questions about. So for example, you can get them to come up with questions about the topic, the literary devices used, the language and tone, and the rhyme scheme or meter. So I say, Shadi, do I have to cover all these points when I'm teaching? But no, it's just it depends on your plan as a teacher. Do you want to cover only 2 areas, 1 area, 3 areas? It depends. Do you want only to focus in this lesson on literary devices? Do you want to focus on specific literary devices like metaphors or similes? It's up to you. And again, if you want questions to be focused on 1 area, then say that to your students. Like if we're talking about boom, 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 what type of questions would you come up with? Students will come up with questions here. They compare their questions in groups, and then they come up with a list of questions. Some questions about the topic, some questions about tone of voice, some questions about literary devices. Your job here as a teacher in the feedback is that you make sure that your students' questions covered all the areas you wanted. And if there is an area missing, you direct them. So what about this part? What about this question here? And then after that, we come to the investigation stage. And in the investigation stage, there are 2 things that you need to do. First, make sure that they provide evidence for whatever statement they have about the topic, the literary device. So if someone said, for example, that the poem is rich in metaphors, evidence, examples. If someone said, this sonnet is blah, 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 why? But they need to provide that. And it will help if you give them maybe an example or something. And then on their own, they start researching, and you guide them to the sources or the types of sources they have. And if you're going to follow the ELB, then sources are very important, because this is how students are going to survive through the lesson. This is how they're going to search for information and come to conclusions and all that stuff. So you either have a library in the classroom or an access to a library at the school where you work, or an internet library, so students have kind of access to the internet, and you recommend websites. Wonderful. After the investigation stage, we move to the conclusion stage. And in the conclusion stage now, students take the data they collected, and you can get them to work with different groups, or and exchange the ideas they have. what they have to say about the topic and their evidence, what they have to say about the tone of voice, their evidence, what they have to say about literary devices, their evidence, meta, and the like. And they compare with their partners. And finally, they come to conclusions about everything. After students, reach conclusions, it is time now for the last stage, which is discussion, where students might nominate one from each group to present their discoveries, to present the areas they explored and what they have come to. And here, the feedback of the teacher is very important, because it is time now to filter what your students have come up with. Because of course, mistakes might happen. They might reach a wrong conclusion. So you're there and and you're well prepared. So you say, I believe you were not right here when you talked about this metaphor. Actually, this wasn't a metaphor, it was a simile. And then you start discussing things. No, that was the wrong literary device here. I don't think that's right about the tone of voice here. Some people say, and a discussion emerges. And you ask students to produce their evidence, and then you analyze that with them. So it's very important that you do that. So you listen to your students presenting, you take notes on the good things, the correct conclusions they've come to, and also the wrong things, and then you play your role now as a teacher, checking everything, and giving them the final say. So again, that was a quick example of how you would follow the ILB or the ELB framework for teaching literature. And as we said, it can be used with many subjects. It can be used in many fields. But I chose literature because many people ask me to talk more about literature. Now, if you have any question about ILB or ELB, I'll be down there in the comments responding immediately to your questions. Thank you very much. See you again, my friends. Bye-bye.